Hi everyone, welcome to episode 78 of the Startup Playbook podcast. My name is Rohit Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors, and subject matter experts on how they got started, the strategies they use to succeed, and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. My guest for this podcast episode is Topaz Conway. Topaz is an entrepreneur, angel investor, director, and an advocate to the creation of a stronger Australian innovation culture. Earlier in her career, she was a biotech specialist at VC firm Pacific Horizon Ventures and went on to become the CEO of bioengineering company Citopedia, which later sold to Beckton Dickenson. She was also the founder of wine club Vinetails, which was profitable within 2 years and ended up being acquired just 2 years and 8 months after launching. Topaz is now playing an active role in developing a stronger startup ecosystem across Australia. Among other roles, she is a director at Cicada Innovations Incubator, a director of StartupAUS, and chair of board of directors for SBE Australia, which runs the Springboard Enterprises Accelerator and E3 programs. In this interview, we talk about starting with problems instead of solutions, the need for generosity, effective networking, the importance of being coachable, and what to ask yourself before you start fundraising. Without further ado, here is my interview with Topaz Conway. Hi Topaz, welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast, and thanks so much for taking the time to be on the show today.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So for those people that may not be as familiar with you or your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
It's a long story, but I'll make it short. I started really my interest in business at a pretty young age, as a child, and then worked my way up through some of the normal channels. And it sort of midway through my career is when I realized that I was unemployable, basically. And in those days, entrepreneur was not a common word, but that was really why, because no matter where I went, I was always the one who was harassing people, saying, well, why are you doing it that way when it can be done a better way? And all I did was drive everybody crazy. So basically, I ended up having to be an entrepreneur and work for myself at some point. And I got that opportunity really in a more serious way. I had small businesses way back when, and then I did do a stint in the corporate world. But when I came to Australia for 10 years and then went back to the US right about the .com time, and I really wanted to see what that was all about, and ended up being in a company that our primary clients were .coms, and that was my first exposure to what was happening in the tech space, what was happening with investment and venture capital, and I saw it all crash and burn, all for good reason. But I decided to stay in it, and I ended up being a CEO of a bioengineering company, which was an early stage company that was venture backed, and we took that through product development, product launch, and an ultimate sale. And that was like the PhD of fun in my life. We pretty much covered every possible challenge, every possible roadblock, every possible catastrophe, and but I've never had so much fun in my entire life. So I took a couple months off, gazing at my navel, trying to figure out what next. I did work for a venture capitalist for a while. I found that kind of challenging for a number of reasons, which I won't go into, and then decided to start my own business. So I launched an online wine business, as you do, and grew that for a couple of years, and then decided to come back to Australia. And I sold it and sold everything and moved back to Australia in end of 2007. From there, I was in Brisbane for a bit, which was a bit of a culture shock. Then I came back to Sydney, which is where my parents lived. And what I found was that there was just sort of a wasteland when it came to startup companies and entrepreneurs. I went looking, and nobody would admit to being one. It was almost like, no, I'm not, don't say that word. It was a dirty word. This was in 2009. And I just decided there was something wrong with that picture. So I finally found like-minded people who were interested in the space, who had worked overseas as well, and had that same interest in helping to create a different kind of environment for anybody who wanted to start a startup company.
Fantastic. just really curious to go back right to the beginning, where you say that you were almost kind of forced into, or you had that decision made for you, in terms of having to jump in and become an entrepreneur and start your own thing as well. I'm sure that there are, some listeners at home who are going through that process at the moment that, are asking all of the questions, or are within a corporate environment where they don't feel as comfortable and potentially doesn't feel right. But it can be a difficult transition to make, to leave the safety of that sort of process. Do you have any sort of advice or approaches that kind of helped you go through that process of deciding to leave that behind and go pursue a business or whatever passion you want to follow?
Wow. Well, some of it is just that drive to continually question the way things are done and find better ways of doing it is something you don't turn on and off. And so in the corporate sector, I could not stifle myself as a lot of my bosses would have liked. And some of those decisions were made for me. I'd get fired, So I knew I was unemployable because I was always questioning doing it because that's the way we've always done it. And I would see inefficiencies, and I would see ways that you could streamline process or make people feel more valued within an organization, and the cultures would not support that. So there's a little bit of I didn't have a choice at different times throughout my career. And when I was going through this, it was a different era. I mean, it's an accepted thing now that people will have 5 to 10 different careers in their life. And in those days, if you didn't stay with the same company until you died, it was considered you were a flake. So it was it probably made me tough. It probably made me more determined. It probably created who I am today, but it wasn't easy. And I think it's easier these days. And the biggest challenge really is just getting over the fear of being broke all the time until you get it right.
Yeah, I think I've kind of spoken about this on the podcast as well. So I left my engineering job to go jump into a fashion tech startup, knowing nothing really about the industry, and ran that for a little while until I found out 3 years later what everyone else seemed to know 6 months in, that it wasn't really something that was scalable and something that was going to work long term. But getting to that phase of things not working and it being terrible, but coming out on the other side, you realize that there isn't actually the safety net is actually quite high, especially in a country like Australia. And losing your job and not having any income isn't actually a terrible outcome, because you can always get another job. But what I couldn't live with personally was the regret of not having tried that. And I think that that's a very similar thing from having spoken to a lot of founders on the podcast as well. Was that something, a similar experience for you and some of the things that you see from the Accelerator program as well?
Yes, I mean, we see through all the hats that I wear, which are several, but they're all related because I work with startup companies all the time. There's a combination. There's a combination of people who just knew that they had to do it. They had to start a company. They didn't have to go through a process of feeling they needed security of a real job in order to get there. Then there's people who go into the corporate sector or into a job and they don't feel satisfied for whatever reason. There isn't that sort of, they don't go home at night and say, oh, I want to think more about my job. And that motivates them. So I think, yes, we see through all the programs that with SBE Australia, Springboard, with Cicada Innovations, which is another one that I do, people do it for passion, because they really want to make a difference with whatever it is that they're creating for a piece of the population. Some pieces of the population are bigger than others, but as an entrepreneur, all of us need to ask ourselves the question, what problem are we solving and for who, and how big is that problem?
So obviously running an accelerator program, you would have access to so many different startups at various stages along their journey. What are some of the commonalities between startups that have thought things through versus startups that are sort of chasing an idea versus something that's more realistic?
That's a really good question, and a really big question, actually, because there's all kinds of things that motivate somebody to want to start a company or start a business. And sometimes it's, I've got this great idea, which I love, and they never talk to anybody else about that, but they certainly love it. And so they build it, and then they say, okay, well, who are my customers? Where are my customers? And they haven't actually thought that through. That's not ideal, obviously, not the ideal way to do it. And then there's people that, work and look around and see problems that they say, well, this is a problem. I know I can make this work. I know it's much simpler. And they go and talk to people, they do their homework, they understand that they actually do have a market, then they go build it, which is obviously a better way to do it. And then there's people who, like I've worked with entrepreneurs who are unbelievable executioners of the strategy and the plan, and they bring that skill set. And there's passion behind that and everything else, but because they haven't actually tested their market to see if they have a market, it all kind of goes to waste. But the key thing is that no matter where you're tripping up in that journey, you just have to, pick yourself up and say, well, okay, I screwed up on that one. Next time, I'm not going to do that. Next time, I've learned I better go talk to customers or potential customers first and find out if they really want this.
That's a really interesting point that you've raised, and I think one of I think we've sort of mentioned this on the podcast before, but one of the conversations that I've been having with a lot of people in terms of developing the ecosystem is, it's not necessarily about how do we get more people to jump in and start a startup, but it's also for the people that have tried and the first idea hasn't worked, how do we ensure that we create a support system to allow them to take those learnings, and instead of going back and doing other things, allow them to take that into their next company and potentially the next one after that. I guess what are your views in terms of, it can be really difficult, and sometimes the best pathway for someone is to try something and then realize that, they're much better off going to corporate as well. So it's not to say that everyone should be running a business and multiple businesses, but it can be very, very financially and mentally draining to keep going, especially after you've devoted so much of yourself to something. Do you have any advice to founders that are going through that process at the moment?
Yes, I mean, I think as culturally here in Australia, we have struggled with that kind of environment that really supports people no matter what. So I started my businesses all in the US, and I have to say that the culture in Seattle, where my businesses were based, I knew I had an entire community around me at all times who were there for moral support, for financial support, for information, for introductions. No matter what, they rallied around me. When I said I'm going to start an online wine club, they didn't say, what? What the hell's that? Because I was actually the first wine club in the US. They didn't know what a wine club was. And even my friends who encouraged me to do it didn't know what a wine club was. But they said, that's great, that's a great idea. I can help. And I got investment and everything else. But what we lack here, I think, and it is slowly changing because we're getting now a generation of entrepreneurs that have done successful companies here in Australia, is that generosity of spirit, of knowledge, of contacts, of learnings, of just support. And it's taken us a long time to get to the point where we realize that that is a critical part of success for any entrepreneur, is that you have a network of people who believe in you. And we've taken a very long time to get here.
Absolutely. It's, as you mentioned, Australia is still a very young and a very small ecosystem. In terms of developing that culture, do you think it's just something that is, a timing issue? So is it just that we haven't had enough founders that have gone through that experience to be able to come back and provide that same support and that creation of that ecosystem? Or do you think that there are particular things that we can do to help push that and speed that along a bit further?
I think some of it's timing. I think some of it's cultural. That real generosity piece is not necessarily a core cultural quality that Australia has nurtured over the generations. We're very nice to each other, but that real deep generosity of time. Like I've given talks about this before about networking and how everybody says, oh, you got to go network and go to places and go to events and talk to as many people as you can. And I said, no, I can't tell you how many people reach out to me because they want to pick my brain or they want to have coffee with me. Well, tell me why you want to have coffee with me, because my time is precious. But I always say yes. But I can't tell you how many times I've said yes, and people come and they don't even thank me at the end for my time. And I think that's just an example of what I'm talking about. It's that appreciation. It's a two-way street. I mean, I'm a very generous person, but I can see how I could become not a very generous person if I'm feeling like there isn't an appreciation on the other side of what I'm saying or what I have to offer. So I think we can do better. We can have better manners about it. We can actually listen to advice. A lot of people who are asking for input, but really not wanting to hear it. And so just be clear. Be very clear about what you're asking for. And if you're asking, then listen. Doesn't mean you have to do it. You wouldn't do everything anybody told you, but be appreciative of the time that people with experience are willing to spend with you. Because none of us, those of us who are out there doing it all the time, never charge for it. A cup of coffee is $3.40 an hour. So,
yeah, it's again, like, it's something that I've kind of spoken about a lot. So I have this policy where pretty much for everyone that asks for a coffee or asks for advice, I will spend at least 5 to 10 minutes on the phone if I can't have a meeting with them. Mm-hmm. But again, like, it is very rare to hear someone say thank you for introductions or just kind of time spent and those type of things as well. It's obviously not why you do it, but it helps. And it's not so much about that first meeting as well. I think the point that you touched on about networking, the number of times that I've heard people say, how do I build a network? Like, I go out and I hand my business cards to 30, 40 people, and I chase them up and no one wants to meet with me afterwards, or I don't feel like I'm progressing. Networks are more about, what is the actual relationship that you're building with someone, and less so how many business cards you've sent out. So if I'm going to events, for example, I'm only really chatting to 3 or 4 people at most, and I really want to spend 15, 20 minutes getting to know them and understand how I can help or who I can connect them onto, because that's really how you build a network, not by just spamming out business cards or LinkedIn connections.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key point is what you said. It's about relationships, building a relationship, and the relationship has to have purpose. And to say, I want to have a coffee, without coming with a list of very specific things that you want to talk about and help that you need, just says, well, I haven't thought about it. I don't care enough about you to know what to ask or what I need from you or what I'd like from you if you're willing to give it. So yeah, it's just putting that thought into what you do with your relationships that I think we have to work harder on here.
Absolutely. So I guess diving into that a little bit deeper, for someone that wants to reach out to you, what is it from your perspective that would make that a really valuable connection or coffee for you to have and start building a relationship from?
Well, I can give you one example that stands out, and sadly, it was an example that happened probably 3 years ago. But it was really poignant to me. And like I said, I get people who reach out all the time because I'm out and about a lot. And this woman was actually referred to me through a friend, and so of course I said yes. I mean, I say yes anyway, but especially when it's a friend referring. And I met with her, and she had very specific questions about where she was with her business and the next strategic step, and knew that I had some experience in that area because she had done her homework. She asked me those questions. She listened very carefully, asked thoughtful questions back. So I knew that she was really was really listening and wanting that advice. And at the end of the conversation and the coffee, she said, "Thank you so much." First of all, she said that, and I almost fell off my chair. And then the second thing she said to me was, "What can I do for you? Is there anything that I could do for you?" And I did fall off the chair, and literally, even though there was at that point nothing that I could think of that she could do for me, the fact that she said to me she valued my time and wanted to be able to offer anything she could offer. And my response to her was, just keep me informed as to how you're going, because that is really what I would love from you. And she did. So, but that's the only time that's ever happened. But it's an example of, what I still to this day tell that story and remember that. It's as one of the most valuable hours I've spent in my life was, talking to this woman who I haven't seen her since, but I've heard from her periodically.
And the funny thing is, and I'd be really curious to see if this is your perspective as well, but the more people look at that as a two-sided relationship that's being built, the more you generally want to go out of your way to help, because any further introductions that you want to make, that you're passing on someone who's credible and trustworthy and kind of passes your filter. So you're much more willing to open up your network and open up opportunities for them as well, which is something that's not really understood, I think, by most people. Yeah,
that opening up of networks is something I do a lot of. I do tons of introductions, and there's nothing I hate more than having to follow up and say, well, did you contact this person? I mean, people are getting really a lot better about that, but it's amazing that has to be a learned behavior rather than an automatic behavior. Of course, I come from the era where you do handwritten thank you notes as well, so I'm not suggesting that.
So I guess pivoting slightly into Springboard, it's how long has Springboard been running now?
Springboard's been running globally for 17 years in the US. It's been running here in Australia. We're going into our 6th year here in Australia. So we brought it here in kind of the end of 2011 is when we actually launched our very first opening for applications, and then held the boot camp in early 2013. So 2013 was our first delivery of a program here in Australia.
So one of Australia's first real sort of accelerator programs as well. So if I'm being honest, I had heard of Springboard before. I'd heard of some of the companies that have come through. Obviously, we've had Ainsley from Quali and Noga from Urban U on the show as well, both fantastic founders. Yeah. But I guess the more that I kind of looked into this, preparing for this interview as well, I was just astounded by just the level of success that you've had as, probably one of the most successful accelerator programs that are based in Australia. For people that maybe aren't as familiar with Springboard, do you want to share a little bit about the program and the model that you work under?
Sure. So the organization is called SBE Australia, and it's an umbrella organization, for lack of a better word. So we're a not-for-profit. We are funded by a combination of corporate sponsorship and grants. And we have 2 programs that we run now. One is called E3, and that is for an earlier stage program. We just launched that last year. It's still, companies that are operational and have product in the market, but are not quite ready for our next phase accelerator program, which is called Springboard, and that's the one you were referring to earlier, that we launched 6 years ago. So Springboard is really focused on that next global step that a female entrepreneur wants to make. So especially when we started 6 years ago, what we were finding was women would start businesses, a lot of businesses. There was a small proportion of them that were starting tech businesses or some other kind of more scalable business. And they would get to sort of this $5 million revenue mark, and then boom, it's just, that was good enough. I don't want to, I'm not going to do anything else with it. And that was happening globally. So really what Springboard does is it takes women who sort of are in that nicely established or about establishing phase of a domestic market here in Australia. Some will have global views already, but generally speaking, that next step is to open up in a global market. And we specifically have a strength in the U.S. market because of our partnership with the U.S. Springboard program. So what we do is really work on two things. We work on the woman herself and her own internal biases about what she can and cannot do, which are very deeply embedded in us. And it may not be something we even would say out loud, but psychologically we are geared to not taking other people's money. We're geared to thinking, well, big is bad, money is bad. Too much money is not a good quality to have. I don't want to say that out loud. I mean, sounds really silly, but subconsciously we're all kind of raised that way. Women are, and so we help them get over that, and we help them think bigger, help them understand that growing a company, scaling a company can happen. You can do it. You have a support network around you. We provide that support network. We provide the other half of that, which is the tool set, which is really looking at doing a deep dive into her business and looking at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, all those pieces that she needs to have a closer look at and to be truly scalable and investable. And generally speaking, when you get into that global phase, you need money. So we say we help them be investable. However, if that means doing it through revenue, more power to you. If it means not raising too much, that's great. But what we want you to do is really understand your business, understand your opportunity, understand how you're going to get there, and who your customer is.
Absolutely. Is it difficult? So you mentioned, women especially have been brought up historically to think a certain way in terms of, larger is not necessarily better. Has it been difficult for you in terms of running the program to break down those, thoughts or views on things, or are you sort of more looking for founders that have already broken past that and are looking for the support to help them get to their sort of larger ambitions?
Look, I think especially the younger generation of women are less consciously that way, and probably less subconsciously that way. But the reality of building a business means that you're continually having to have meetings or introductions or do business with men in high places, whether that's as a B2B customer or as a venture capitalist or an investor. And that's kind of where she hits her head, and it's a wow moment. I didn't think this was still happening. But sometimes it's also so subtle, they don't know it. So they'll go and pitch 150 times to 150 different investors and be told no. The guy waiting in the room behind them goes in, same business, same everything, and he gets funded. So the stats just came out in the U.S. Venture capital stats that showed, even though there's more dollars that were given to women last year, the actual percentage of women out of all the venture money given has not shifted. And so that's where it shows. That's where we're not there yet. And as much as some of the younger women and even some of the older women who come through the program may have a really positive attitude, they sooner or later run into the walls, and that's where what we do with Springboard is we really bring them back to the business case, back to their core value as a female founder, and surround her with a bunch of people who remind her of that and help her through and she has access to resources who will help her answer the difficult problems.
Absolutely. I think there's this misconception as well about just business in general, that after you're making, you're generating $5 million in revenue, all of the problems go away. The problems are still there, they just change and evolve over time, and the problems become a bit more difficult as well. So how, obviously, I would see a huge value of Springboard being, as you mentioned, the people the people being around these companies, almost acting as mentors of the program or of the businesses. So for people that aren't necessarily part of an Accelerator program, what should they look for in the right mentor or the right people to talk to for advice for their business?
That's, boy, if I had the magic solution to that question, I'd be a very wealthy woman because I'd charge for it. But, some of it is being informed yourself going into that relationship. Don't be fooled by somebody's resume. And certainly with entrepreneurism here in Australia, the pendulum's gone from nothing to 180 degrees the other direction, where there's too much noise, too much opportunistic kind of energy around this sector. And I see a lot of bad advice going around under the guise of being experienced. And, read between the lines with who you're talking to and what their motivation is. A really good entrepreneur mentor is somebody who wants to help you because they want to help you. And they don't go in saying, I want a piece of your company to help you. When I was doing my companies, the kind of help I got were people who were doing it because they wanted to. They wanted to see me successful. They never mentioned money. They never mentioned equity. At a point, if you start getting true value from that relationship, as an entrepreneur, you offer it. But at some point, after the value has been realized. So my warning is there's a lot of opportunistic consultants who would love to get pieces of what you're doing, and some will embed themselves in your company to get that. But I also see that there's a lot of inexperience in that realm, and therefore a lot of bad advice. So just be careful and seek out the people or the programs. I mean, that's one of the reasons we, at Springboard, I think why our results are as good as they are is because we have very experienced people both within the program here, but also we bring them from the US, and they're like 4-time entrepreneurs. A lot of them have gone through Springboard program 4 times. With every new company that they start, they go back because they get that kind of value from the network.
Fantastic. Obviously, from a Springboard perspective as well, I imagine that you must get a lot of applications that come through, but like with any program, there's only a certain amount of companies that you can work with. What is it specifically that you look for in the companies that you do decide to take through the program?
So we only take 10 at a time, so that's 10 per year in our tech program. And we look for, the qualities have to be that it's actually a good idea, it's a good product, that you have the product in the market, and that there is a good scalable opportunity that is of global interest, not just Australia interest. But underlying all of that is this element of coachability, and we do assess whether or not you can be coached. And if the agreement of the committee is, that's doing the interviews, is that she's not coachable, then she won't get in. And we have had, in the past, people who were borderline, so to speak, and taking punts on them, and it's worked out really well because part of the program, part of our IP is a part of the program that kind of weeds that bit out, the resistance to advice part, which is never any fun for the women going through it, but at the end they say that it's the best thing that could have happened. So it's mostly just finding the good companies and the good founders, because anybody who's been in this space knows that it's all about the founder and their ability to execute, because you can have a really bad founder and a great idea and it'll fail, or you can have a really bad idea and a great founder, and that founder will go on and do something better.
Absolutely. The whole topic of coachability has come up so many times on this podcast from so many different groups. I think, as you said, it's such an important quality in founders, but there's also a very fine line between, as you mentioned earlier, of just taking everyone's advice and drawing out, what advice is relevant and what isn't, and it can be really hard to gauge that. Do you have any specific tests that you run around the coachability of someone, or is that generally an instinct and a gut feel based on your experience?
It's kind of a gut feel, and we put them all through a live, a face-to-face interview with a table full of people, which can be very intimidating, and there's a Q&A session as well. I mean, we don't make it intimidating, but that kind of situation often will bring out different things in people. But it is impossible to really know for sure. But there is an instinct around coachability that I think happens. Same as there's an instinct around the quality of the advice you're getting. And again, my red flags when I'm listening are, here's my resume. I've worked at, I'm not going to name names, but these blue chip companies, and I worked in the M&A department, so therefore I know all about startups. And that. And then you ask them a few questions and get them talking, and you can kind of nail it. You can kind of pick it. So I've got a good nose for that now, but not everybody does. It's just, again, I guess, I don't know. It's like everything. The most valuable people that I've run across in my life are often the most humble. And so that's kind of a barometer for me.
Absolutely. And in terms of, you spoke about some of the factors that you, or characteristics that you look for in Springboard. Does that change at all when looking at earlier stage companies through the E3 program?
Yes and no. I mean, we're still looking for good companies. We probably are not as strict on where they're at as a company, although we do want them to not just be, we don't operate at the ideas on a napkin phase at all. You have to actually have built something and preferably be in the market already, but thinking about scaling, or even within Australia. So we started it really because we wanted a stronger pipeline into this Springboard program. So we find that especially in the early years, that we were getting women who had all the good ingredients, but were lacking some of the real basics in their business. Some of that's financials. I mean, most of the entrepreneurs, male or female, that I run into, do not know their financials. Well, I'm a person. I'm not an accountant, but I'm an investor, and I won't look at a company unless I see a set of financials, because they'll tell me the truth. No matter what comes out of the founder's mouth, I look at the money and I can kind of see, exactly what's going on. And a founder needs to love that. They need to love the fact that their numbers will tell their story when they're tongue-tied and they can't, because it will. And so everything that comes out of your mouth should be an investor should be able to see that in the assumptions you've made and your projections and your, the cost of acquisition of a customer and how much that customer's lifetime value is, and those kinds of things, shows that you're thinking. And then I have something to hold on to as an investor, to ascertaining whether you're going to be able to execute on this, and whether you're just blowing smoke or whether you actually know what you're talking about.
Absolutely. I guess just going, again, just touching on that point, I had Adrian Stone on my podcast a few months ago, and I think one of the things that he mentioned was the best thing that he ever did was just on the back of an envelope wrote down the numbers of what type of revenue he wanted, and what the number of companies were that he needed to onboard, and he just said, Australia's too small for me, I need to move to the US. And the number of startups that I meet that say, we're following this specific business model and we want to be a $100 million, billion-dollar business, but again, don't even just go through how many, what does our funnel look like? How many companies do we need to meet with each month, or demo the product to, or to be able to hit just kind of basic revenue targets is just a great starting point to at least help set a framework of what sort of targets and financials will allow you to get to that next stage as well. Yeah,
I mean, that's such a great point. This is a silly story, but it demonstrates exactly what you're talking about. I go to a sports massage guy who was talking about expanding into an office into a downtown location, and told me what the rent was going to be, and we were talking about the business. And I said, okay, tell me how many massages you're going to have to do per day to pay the rent. Have you done that math? And he said, oh, no. And I said, well, let's do it. So we sat there and actually did the numbers. And it was impossible for him to do that many. There weren't enough hours in the day for him to do that many in order to actually cover just the rent that they were asking on this particular building. So it's those kinds of very simple things that you're right, that they're things we don't know maybe intuitively, but we should be thinking in that kind of context, I think, as entrepreneurs.
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially from a money perspective, I find that it's so much easier to spend money than to think about what is the return on anything that I'm doing. The number of startups that I've seen as well that have raised a small seed round or have raised a round and then just go into a hiring phase where they hire way too many people that it's not sustainable and really limits their ability to give them the runway for them to be able to become sustainable is really limits their opportunity to be successful in the long run, which is what everyone's trying to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, you've hit on something that I think is really, really important, and that is raising capital, right? Everybody thinks raising capital is the sign of a success. Raising capital has nothing to do, essentially, with success. It's what you do with the capital that determines whether you are going to be successful. And I get people all the time who come to me and say, we're starting a raise, we're going to raise $1 million, and we're going out next week. And I said, well, where's the $1 million going to get you? Oh, we're going to go out and hire X, Y, Z. I said, no, that wasn't the question. Where will that $1 million investment make a difference in the value of your company that is greater than it is today? Well, we're going to go hire so-and-so and so-and-so, and they're going to write more code. And I'm going to say, no, come back. If I give you $1 million today and you say, I need that to grow my company and make it more valuable for you, as well as for the entrepreneur, and what does that look like? What does that mean? Are you going to have more sales? Are you going to have more, are you going to be in more geographies? Are you going to go from beta to, commercial launch? And are you going to have 10 customers? Are you going to have 10,000 customers? What does that look like? Because when you get there, you're going to be broke. And you're going to come back and say, I want more money. And I'm going to say, what did you do with my $1 million? And are we worth more than we were a year ago when you raised $1 million? And just even that, I can't tell you, male, female, doesn't matter. People who don't understand that money has to be related to value inflection. And you have to define that. What does success look like? So anyway, that's a pet peeve of mine.
It is, I think you kind of touched on with Springboard, a big focus is companies that are looking to become global, or at least to expand and scale. At what stage should a company be starting to think about that as well? I guess coming back to that early point about sort of finances, there's a temptation that you've got one client on, you suddenly want to expand into 4 different cities and have offices in each of them. What is, from your experience, what's the right time for companies to really start thinking about scaling operations and grow, expansion? What's the right approach that they should take in doing that effectively?
That's not a simple answer because it really depends on your product. So some software products, for instance, should be thinking globally. Well, everybody should be thinking globally from day one. Is this something that the world needs, or is this something that Melbourne needs? And really be honest about that. And so if you know it's a global product, and something like a software, an online product, can be global as soon as you launch it. So it really depends on what the product is and where your market entry is. And if you choose Australia, which a lot of people do, I know that in the SaaS area, it is one of the toughest markets in the world to launch a SaaS product. So if you choose to do your market entry in Australia and you get it right, then you're probably set. You can pretty much go anywhere and probably do well. A lot of people, though, say, this is all too hard. They go to the States and they try it there, and they get a couple of bites in the States, and then they end up being able to sell it back here. So coming back to Australia after you have a couple bites in another country, this is just a generalized model. If you have other kinds of products, again, you know, Australia is a great testing ground, and other countries use Australia as their technology testing ground, because if you mess up, nobody knows. And so, I mean, there's some wisdom to that when you think about it. Launch it in a tightly controlled market where you can do your analysis, you can fix tweak your product to make sure that it does work and it doesn't break, and before you make the big leap overseas. And then know your markets. Really do your homework. You know, is the U.S. the best place to do the next market entry, or is Europe? You know, Europe might be better. I was executive chair of a company that had a respiratory device, and our second market entry was Europe, and that made more sense than the U.S. because it was a simpler market for regulatory reasons to get into. So it really, depends on what your product is. But the most important thing is don't spread yourself too thin, and know why you're entering a market and how you're going to enter that market, and what the competitive landscape is in that geography.
Yeah, I love that example as well. I was speaking to a startup recently that had decided to expand to both the US and the UK. So I think they went to the US first, and then 9 months later they expanded to the UK. And immediately within the first 3 months, they were already making 3 times the revenue in the UK than they were in the US. And just because of less competition, smaller market, but they could just penetrate that a lot quicker. And that's again another consideration. Everyone, for right or wrong, thinks US first in Australia, but the US also has a lot of complexities that I think not a lot of people sort of consider as well when it comes to that. So
yeah, we also have Asia, and that's becoming a more accessible market for us, and we shouldn't underestimate the value of that market. So I think there's not too many people working that area, and I think it's a real missed opportunity.
Absolutely. I also love your point that you mentioned about Australia is almost the most difficult place in the world to sell SaaS products, but that means that if you nail it here, that you can sell it anywhere. And I think, again, we talk a lot about the disadvantages that Australia has as an ecosystem. I think that there are plenty of advantages as well, and that we don't capitalize on that. Asia being one of them, our proximity to a huge market as well, that, we just don't, I feel, take advantage enough of as well.
Yeah, I mean, we all have fear of the unknown, right? And Asia is a big unknown for a lot of people. I mean, basics, and language and culture and those kind of things. And so the U.S. is easy. That's kind of the I don't have to work so hard kind of attitude. But the reality is the market opportunity is so much bigger in Asia right now because there's less, like you say, less competition. And the path into those markets is becoming less and less complex.
Yeah. As you mentioned earlier, you're across a lot of different initiatives and programs and organizations. So I feel like you've got such a unique perspective into the ecosystem. From your perspective, what is it that you would like to see Australia do more of to develop?
I think we have a great opportunity to sort of focus ourselves into more centers of excellence in our cities, in our regions. We have strengths. The example I'm thinking of is how the UK, said the UK, great, I forget the slogan, but great is Britain or something, a play on the Great Britain word that for the country. And they set up in different cities sort of centers of excellence around innovation and put money into those and really tried to grow. Now I don't know how successful that was, but the whole idea of making it easier to do business in Australia for innovation and big business to do business together is where I think we can have a great improvement. So that whole thing of innovation needs customers, and customers are your bigger businesses. They all need the innovation, and they can't innovate internally because they're too big. They're too, embedded in their own stifling culture around innovation. It's not part of their business model. When you get to be a big company, your business model is return to shareholders, which is do more of the same, only bigger. So innovation has to come from the outside. And the more we make that easier and more seamless and more incentivized to support our own innovation here in Australia, which we're not good at. We don't buy our own Kool-Aid. We have to go overseas and sell the company in order for our Australian companies to embrace it often. And I know that's shifting a little bit, that dial's getting nudged along, but we have been really bad at adopting our own technologies and our own innovations. So let's break down some of those barriers, or let's incentivize companies to do that. I'm not sure, I don't know what the technical answer is to that, but I think there's an opportunity to really truly make this a testing ground in the truest sense of the word by our big companies taking on those risks of working with some of our entrepreneurs, because they end up working with entrepreneurs from overseas. So it's not a fundamental barrier, it's more of a cultural barrier.
Absolutely. Topaz, thanks so much for coming on the show today and for sharing your experience and insights.
My pleasure.
For anyone that wants to say hello, find out more, get in touch, or thank you for coffee, what's the best way for them to do that?
I can give, you can, if you want to put an email address on your
just
website.
To the
Is that how you
notes,
do it? Yeah, that would be fine.
Yep.
Just be kind.
Great. I'll make sure there's links in the show notes. Once again, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to episode 78 of the Startup Playbook podcast. You can find the show notes of my interview with Topaz, along with a curated list of tools and resources for startup founders at startupplaybook.co. As always, you can join the conversation through our Twitter account. The handle is @PlaybookStartup. Later this week, I'll be back with a new episode of The Hustle. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with our latest interviews. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you at episode 8 of The Hustle later this week.